You have a very stressful 20s. If you're not making as much money, things are more difficult for you. That has to impact your health.
If you have young people shut out of unions, they're not going to support unions. If you have young people shut out of the public service, that's going to probably lead to less support. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today, we're talking about how the feds are slashing jobs with young Canadians taking the biggest hit. What exactly does this mean for the public service's future, and what happens when an entire generation gets shut out of government?
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
Today, we're diving into a tough one, the federal government's recent job cuts and how they're hitting young Canadians the hardest. According to a recent report in the Globe and Mail, the public service lost nearly 10,000 jobs between 2024 and 2025, with almost 80% of those cuts affecting workers in their 20s, who are mostly temporary contract and student positions. Mike, let's start with the big picture here. What exactly is driving these cuts, and why are younger workers, especially those in their 20s, bearing the brunt?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're seeing the federal government wanting to scale back on the size of the public service. It grew quite a bit in the Trudeau years, and particularly during the pandemic. And I think there is a acknowledgement, kind of across the board, that it's grown too large, and that we do need to right size the public service. And full disclosure, I am married to a public servant, so just keep that in mind as I'm talking here. Now, we got to understand that the public service often hires a lot of folks on like 6 month contracts, little temporary contracts, that kind of thing. Partly because there's a lot of just temporary roles that the public service needs to fill, but also it's a way to kind of try people out, right? That they can come in, they can work for 6 months. If it's a good fit, they then go on to more of a permanent job. So, the discussion in the media will often make it sound like that these are actual cuts, like people are losing their jobs. What is more happening is that a lot of those kind of temporary contracts and so on are just not getting renewed, or governments are hiring less of them. Plus, you always have attrition at the top. The public service has a lot of people in their 60s. They retire, they're not getting replaced. So I liken it more to what's going on with international students. We can link to that episode in the show notes. That it's not that we're kicking international students out of the country to lower the numbers. It's just that some are graduating and going home after graduation, and we're kind of limiting the intake. But absolutely, this is not a great thing if you are a person in your 20s who wants to work for the public service. They're just hiring fewer people than they did before. And this is not the first time this has happened. In the 1990s, starting about 95 to say 2000 or so, the federal public service didn't hire that many people after the big Paul Martin Chrétien budget cuts of the mid 1990s. And there's this weird cohort effect, and I can see it as somebody who briefly worked in the public service. I graduated from university from undergrad in 99. For us, it was hard to get a job in the public service. So if you go to the federal public service, there are not that many people in it that were born between like 1970 and 1977, because they were unlucky enough to graduate at a time when the public service wasn't hiring that many people. So we're likely to see that again, that we're likely to see this effect, that if you were born between say 2000 and 2005, you're probably less likely to work for the public service than if you were born in say 1995. And that's going to be a problem for young people. And I know you've advocated a lot for younger voices in politics. And a lot of the discussions that we have, and I know you've had with others, are more on the elected side, right? And so you're talking about younger candidates, younger cabinet appointees, et cetera. But, clearly this is going to affect the other side of government, the unelected side of government. So I would love to get your take on the state of younger workers in the public service and how that's going to impact the political influence of younger Canadians.
Yeah, when we talk about the political influence of younger Canadians, a lot of the attention goes to the elected positions, which is natural because they're the ones in the spotlight a lot of the time. And that's a massive issue, too. We don't have enough younger MPs or cabinet ministers who can advocate on issues like housing affordability and what it's like to be a renter. That older generations really just we haven't seen any evidence that they're really grasping that issue with the urgency that it requires. But the other side of that is this more behind the scenes public service sector, right? And to shut an entire generation out of that is harmful as well, because this is the federal government. It's an institution that's supposed to be developing policy for young Canadians who are bearing the brunt of issues like unemployment, again, housing, immigration, understanding their challenges, representing their interests. And the public service is essentially going to be systemically excluding younger voices and perspectives. That's bad. That's going to affect the policy that's made. That's going to affect what moves forward. And the thing is, because it's behind the scenes again, it won't probably get as much attention. So this is a problem. And I think that while the public service absolutely needs cuts and there is waste to shed, there needs to be some thought put into how we do this without just excluding people in their 20s or their early 30s or the next generation coming up, because you're going to end up with these huge knowledge and perspective and lived experience gaps that will have outcomes in the real world. But I want to go back to the 90s for a second. So, when I brought up this topic in our group chat, and you mentioned it a bit here already, you said that back then the federal government was making these big cutbacks and they went years without new hires essentially. And there was a big age gap in the public service as a result. Can you share a little bit more about what you witnessed back then and what you think its impacts were?
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind that I was only in the public service for 1 year in 2017, so I kind of came as an outsider. But one of the things I always found a little bit funny is I was often either the youngest person in the room by 10 years or the oldest person in the room by 10 years. I had turned 40 in 2017. And yeah, it does make a difference because your cohort is just going to have different lived experiences. They're going to be at different parts of their life. So, for instance, I would have been one of the few people there in all of these meetings that had, a child in like grade 3, for instance. So that makes a difference, right? That
Mhm.
if none of your colleagues have kids in elementary school, it's going to change the amount of time you think about elementary schools. Now, in the federal public service, it doesn't matter as much because we're not in charge of the schools, but those cohort things matter. That the perspective of Gen Xers like me are going to be very different than boomers, that are going to be very different than millennials. And you can imagine a public service, let's say, that didn't have a lot of millennials, is probably not going to think a lot about housing, right? Now, luckily, the federal public service does have a lot of millennials. And I can tell you, somebody who still works closely with people in the federal public service, the fact that there are a lot of millennials around, I actually think does positively impact the way that the federal government thinks about housing, right? If you are a minister or a deputy minister and a large cohort of the people around you are struggling to find a home and talking about it, in meetings or at the coffee shop or whatever, that's going to influence your priorities. And I think that the second potential area is that as the cohort of people older than me retires, it creates a talent vacuum, right? Because most like deputy ministers are going to be between like the ages of like 55 and 65. Once all those folks from the early 70s reach that age, and they're currently to, there's not that cohort of talent to choose from to become ministers or deputy ministers. You're either choosing less talented people, or you're saying, you know what, this person's a little young, she's a millennial, but she's really good. So let's put her, in charge of this department. I think it creates both challenges and opportunities. when you do have this kind of missing cohort of individuals.
Now, I'm curious if we see the same phenomenon play out in the private sector.
Yeah, we absolutely do, and we see it on a very macro level. And there's a substantial body of evidence on this, including one really well-known paper that uses Canadian data. That paper is from 2006 and is called "The Short and Long-Term Career Effects of Graduating in a Recession." So what it does is it looks at college and university grads from the 1980s and 1990s, and it compares labor market outcomes for people who graduated during a recession and those that did not. Because if we look at the 80s and 90s, it was a period of big economic cycles, right? Where, there was an early 80s recession, then things were great. We had a massive economic boom in the late 80s. Things went to crap in the early 90s, kind of recovered again near the end of the decade. So we have these kind of big economic swings. So you can compare, let's say, a person who graduated in 1987 to a person who graduated in 1992, examine those entire cohorts and say, okay, is there a difference in their labor market outcomes? And it turns out there is. So, what the paper found was that graduating in a recession, and this is an exact quote, graduating in a recession leads to large initial earnings losses. These losses, which amount to about 9% of earnings in the initial stage, eventually recede, but slowly, having within 5 years, but not disappearing until 10 years after graduation. So basically, if you graduate in a bad labor market, the next 10 years on average are not going to be great for you relative to somebody who might have graduated 2 or 3 years earlier or 2 or 3 years later and ended up in a better labor market. So this absolutely has longer term impacts that if you are graduating in a terrible job market, that's not just going to affect you right away, but that's going to affect you for a decade or more afterwards.
Now, I imagine this has to have broader economic impacts. We know that high youth unemployment is already costing Canada billions in GDP. And we also know that the federal public service isn't going to be hiring as many young people. And those that are on temporary contracts, like you said, aren't likely to get rehired. So, what are the additional ripple effects this is likely to have?
Yeah, so it's obviously not going to be great for consumer spending. And because, my consumer spending is someone else's job, there's a multiplier effect, right? So if you have a lot fewer young public servants, wandering around the streets of downtown Ottawa, that's not going to be great for all the lunch places and the pubs and the movie theaters and you name it, but also, not great for the apartment market, not great for the condo market and so on. So absolutely it has a multiplier effect. Now, I haven't seen anyone attempt to estimate this, but I know we have some academic economists who watch and listen to the podcast. So if you have, please send it to us. We'd love to see it. But what we can look at is some of the research that examines the overall economic impact just beyond jobs. So, the US National Bureau of Economic Research, one of the big generators of economic research in the US, they have a great piece summarizing the research in this area called The Life Cycle Impacts of Graduating in a Recession. And once again, we'll post in the show notes. There was a paragraph in particular that caught my eye, and I'll just summarize so we can avoid the economic jargon. But what it basically says is that entering the labor market in a recession leads to losses in earnings, wages, and employments that persist for about 10 years. So just like the previous report. But it also says that recent analysis suggests that an unlucky start could also have longer term consequences. A few studies indicated that some impacts on earnings and health can persist until age 40, and the economic conditions in youth and early adulthood may even affect mortality in middle age.
Oh,
So, in
wow.
other words, this isn't just about salary that somebody earns in their mid to late 20s. This research is showing that there is broader implications, including potential impacts on health and lifespan, which makes sense. If you have a very stressful 20s, if you're not making as much money, things are more difficult for you, that has to impact your health. So a lot of economic research is figuring out things that we kind of already intuitively know. And
Mm.
this is one of those things that if things are bad for people in their 20s, either on an individual level or an entire cohort level, that's going to affect their health and well-being. And that's going to persist for some time.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It reminds me of reports that, came out that said shift work has long-term impacts on health, or if you're working night shifts specifically, like that's as bad as smoking on your long-term health impacts. And I think about younger workers, and if they're working overnight, maybe delivering food or as an Uber driver, or they're working all sorts of contracts and side hustles, it'd be interesting to see the long-term impacts of that on health when you don't have your standard routine and maybe you're working nights as well. Like you said, that can add up over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there's research out there about the effect of shift work on health. And so I think it's important to quantify these things. I've always joked that I always wanted to start something called the Journal of the Blindingly Obvious, where we just kind of study things that we all know are true, but we just try and kind of quantify them. Right. It's like, touching a hot stove is painful.
But just how painful.
Just how painful. It's important to quantify those effects. And it does it does matter for public policy
Yeah.
because we want to make sure that we are focusing, every dollar we can, having the biggest outcome. So these effects do matter. But yeah, I do get a bit of a laugh when you read this research and, just as a layperson, you're going like, well, okay, of course. Like, dude, we really need to study that. Now, I actually want to raise another potential unintended consequence of all this. And young people are struggling and older workers can be seen as hoarding jobs. This was a big thing when I was growing up as a Gen Xer. We kept hearing like, oh, we're never going to be able to get jobs because boomers took them all. And that wasn't true. But at the same time, again, that we did have some difficulties, those of us who graduated in the early 90s. So, I know that viewpoint's out there. It's persisted for a while. And even though the story of the Carney cutbacks and the shrinking of the public service really isn't a unionization story, it's more of an attrition story. If I go on Reddit, which I know is a dangerous thing to do, but I do it anyway, I see young folks on there blaming the last in, first out nature of the unionized workforces as why they can't get into the public service or why their 6-month contract isn't leading to something more permanent. So, as a millennial who's tuned into what younger Canadians are feeling, how do you think this wave of job losses in both the public and private sector might change the way that Gen Z and millennials view our labor market institutions like unions?
It will have an impact. And I think there's already been an impact over the last, I'd say, well, 15 years now, because I graduated during the Great Recession. So I was one of those young people who went into a really rough job market. And there were similar feelings that, older workers weren't choosing to retire or they'd stay on and consult. And so there was a feeling that, yeah, older generations were hoarding some of the jobs. And then this led to a lot of people in my age group, including myself, being freelancers for a long time, working contract jobs, and having a really tough time getting those full time jobs that had a bit more security with benefits, and especially in unionized environments.
Mhm.
My background is obviously media journalism, where a lot of those newsrooms are unionized. And I've been a part of some of those unions throughout my career, and I've freelanced for places that have unions. And it's been difficult because the last in, first out, you are the first to go when there are layoffs. And that's frustrating, especially when you look at sometimes, older workers who have been there a long time, whose skills don't always keep up with the times. And those are the jobs that are protected, and they're likely also making significantly more than you. So I actually wrote about this in a column for the National Post a couple years ago, and maybe we can link to it in the show notes, that it's something unions have to think about if they want to continue to have the level of support amongst the Canadian public that they've enjoyed over the last little while. Because if younger Canadians and workers feel that unions aren't protecting their interests and are actually, in some cases, working against them, that's going to affect public support, which will then affect political support. And when you have things like strike negotiations, that's going to be problematic for them. And I think young people instinctively like the idea of organized labor in unions for the most part. But the reality is, we're getting screwed over by a lot of them. And there's also a lot of things like, even if you're contributing as a freelancer or on a contract, unions sometimes have stipulations that you can only do a certain amount of work or a certain number of hours, or you can't do this and you can't do that. So you're running into so many walls already on the employment market and just trying to get a foothold for future economic opportunity. And then you have unions a lot of the time saying, well, you can't do this and you can't do that. And sorry, you can't make this type of money. And sorry, you're the first one to lose your job. So it is a big problem and it's something that needs to be addressed. And if it's not, I think that, yeah, support will continue to plummet. There will be consequences for unions as a result. Now, I want to ask you this as a wrap up. If you were advising the Carney government on how to actually achieve meaningful public service reform, not just easy cuts like we've been talking about,
Mhm.
what would you tell them? How would you balance fiscal responsibility, which we absolutely do need, but with not sacrificing an entire generation of public servants?
Yeah, it is a tough challenge, to be sure. And I do think that the focus, should be on right sizing government and making sure that every dollar is spent as effectively as possible. But I don't think these things have to be at odds with each other. I certainly think we can look at things like voluntary buyouts, early retirements, things like that, which can accomplish a couple things at once. That first, it can you know reduce the size of the public service, but also still allow us to get some fresh, young blood in there, some new ideas, and so on. I know that if government tried this, the headline in the newspapers would be, 20,000 public service get, golden parachutes or what have you. But I think in the long run, it can end up saving money because you're hiring younger workers, and it allows for a more broad cohort of people, so you don't have a lot of people who are all sharing the same birth year.
It strikes me the same way I was talking about unions, that if you have young people shut out of unions, they're not going to support unions. If you have young people shut out of the public service, that's going to probably lead to less support for the public service and more resentment towards it in the long run. So it's a larger issue that does need to be solved. But that's at our time for today. So thank you everyone so much for watching and listening, and to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about being a public servant born in the 1970s, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.